Hello, everyone. I'm Orsola Costantini. I'm Economic Affairs Officer at UNCTAD. And I welcome you to this third day of the UNCTAD YSI Summer School. In the past 2 days, we've talked about international dollar, money, finance, speculation, commodities. Today, we are actually going to focus more on the real economy. What it means to talk about real economy is in a digital era is something that we are going to find out today. It's famous, the famous saying that apparently by Solo, that computers are everywhere except in the productivity statistics, is something that sadly is still true today, and we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss precisely what is really the value, what terms we can talk about value of immaterial capital, of immaterial labor, and of the impalpable stuff that innovation is made of, and its controversial implications in terms of distribution and employment. To talk about that with us, we have two excellent researchers, Ariel Wirkierman, who's a lecturer at Goldsmith University, and Antonio Andreoni, who's a senior researcher at SOAS in London. Without much further ado, I want to give the floor first to Ariel Wirkierman, and after that to Antonio Andreoni. So please, Ariel, you can start.
Thank you, Orsola. It's a great pleasure to be here together with Antonio. And I will quickly share my screen to see if it works. Hopefully you should be now able to see the screen. I hope you can. Can you see it? Let me see if in the chat it's clear. Okay. So today, okay, great. Let me see if it scrolls. Yes, it does. Great. So today I'd like to speak broadly about, well, I would like to thank the invitation to the organizers for this session on technological divides, robots, data, intellectual property, and income distribution, and implications for income distribution of these technological divides that are emerging. I would like mainly to talk about three aspects interconnected, which are technological unemployment, the relationship between humans and machines, tasks, jobs, and occupations, so the way the division of labor is changing in this era of smart technologies, and then the value of data, the dichotomy between physical and digital output, and what it implies for the value of data. There are many questions that one could ask, going from whether our jobs will be replaced by robots or will we complement intelligent machines. How will this affect the share of labor income? What are the implications for income entitlements? For example, when a machine learning algorithm generates new income streams, what is the value of data, and whether our economy will dematerialize as we increasingly digitalize production and consumption. The focus, however, will be circumscribed because there are many smart technologies available concerning also the biological realm, for example, but I will try to focus on advanced digital production technologies, which are technologies combining hardware, software, connectivity applied to production that mainly characterize the fourth industrial revolution. I will try to go briefly on the different topics that I'll be touching upon, but there will be discussions, so please feel free to ask questions after this first presentation. If we start with the topic of technological unemployment, we can broadly depict three chronological stages of technical change involving fixed capital. Fixed capital meaning those non-financial assets that are used in production over several accounting periods, for example, machinery, plants, equipment. First, we have mechanization, that is typically related to the first industrial revolution, then computer-based automation, and finally, what we are currently experiencing with robotization coupled with cloud computing. I would like to first go a bit deeper into the economic aspects of the mechanization debates, typically from classical political economy. Already in the early 19th century, Charles Babbage, on the economy of machines and manufacturers, a book which is really interesting, seen a couple of hundreds years afterwards, has to do with how will the economy adapt to mechanization, the effects of machinery. And that was really debated in classical political economy at the time after David Ricardo and his principles of political economy. And in the context of Britain, the Luddites fallacy was counteracted, but was to be counteracted. That is, the Luddites fallacy was that knitting frames and the introduction of mechanized looms would leave textile workers in Britain out of work. This was counteracted by an argument based on capitalist competition. So the idea was that technologies are by definition labor saving, but the decreased price due to the introduction of the new technology would force other producers to upgrade to stay in business, and this would increase demand in the economy upon the reduced price of the product, and then there will be a compensation effect so that new employment would be created due to this increased demand. But what's emerging in this analysis by Babbage was that this new employment, this employment reabsorption would not occur in the same industry as the one introducing the power looms, the mechanized loom, but it would occur in other industries. And this, for example, in R&D, in producing the capital goods themselves, so this is very important in this typical analysis, capital goods are themselves produced very differently from many economic theories, for example, neoclassical theory, where many times we assume that fixed capital is given or is an endowment. So it was crucial, the employment requirements to produce fixed capital. And Babbage clearly identified the fact that in order to analyze the effects of the introduction of automation, we need general interdependence, the relationship between different industries. And in this way, making a jump 100 years forward, logical control in machines passed from the special purpose machine as the power loom to a computer. So this was a key transformation. The fact that logical control now passed to an independent device that could control the production process. This was the key insight of introducing computers into production. By means of dynamic input-output models, models of the inter-industry dependence of the economy, a literature emerged analyzing what would be the implications for employment of this new technical diffusion of computers. And what they found is that an accelerated diffusion path might affect employment to a lesser extent than a slow diffusion path. And this was really important because it showed that it is not only resisting technological adoption, that we may end up in a path of more inclusive and higher employment. And the other tool that this literature used was using what was called wage profit curves in order to understand the potential distributive implications of technological change by drawing the frontier between wages and profits, wage rate and profit rate. In a diagram, it allowed to understand how the shape of this curve would move as new technologies were adopted. And this would allow to assess how different technologies adopted in the economy would change the distribution of income between wages and profits. But there is something that is really new with robotization, with an industrial robot. And that is that usually fixed capital is considered as a machine that is installed or as a device that is installed for a specific use in a specific industry. Many economists, when trying to model this, would think that fixed capital is substitutable ex ante, but in fixed proportions ex post, once it has been installed in the factory. Now, what industrial robots are bringing in is an autonomy, connectivity, flexibility, and functionality for fixed capital that exceeds this traditional consumption. It would be as if fixed capital could really be treated as a jelly-like resource, something that can be changed from one use to the other. And the fact of fixed capital being malleable, interchangeable between production processes and industries is something that defies traditional theories of income distribution, because it allows substitution of capital in different industries using the same fixed capital or related fixed capital. And this is very important in order to assess the value of capital and capital services, which is the way capital is being measured in the system of national accounts. And a related technology coupled robotization is cloud computing. And cloud computing, that is renting computing equipment and storage in a hardware that is operating elsewhere, not where the firm is physically, poses also challenges for the measurement of capital in the system of national accounts. Because when we outsource fixed capital, what we are doing is rendering the hiring process of capital explicit. And this is really interesting because capital services are essentially a sum across all capital assets multiplied by their rental price. Traditionally, national accountants had to find an imputation for this rental price because there are no explicit market transactions for the hiring of capital. Capital is installed in the firm. But by outsourcing fixed capital, this rental process becomes explicit and these prices start to appear in the economy. So the idea of valuing capital as a set of capital services with a very specific income entitlement is coming to the fore with this change to cloud computing. We can go back to these topics if we have time in the discussion. There are several details that I am avoiding. Let me now move to the second big topic, which is that relates tasks, jobs, and occupations. That is the content of labor content. Essentially, jobs are a set of tasks. Tasks are these granular activities in the workplace, and an occupation will be a set of jobs that has similar tasks. So this distinction between tasks, jobs, and occupation is really now being exploited by different databases, such as the Occupational Information Network or the European Classification of Skill, Competencies, and Occupations. It's being exploited to create typologies and combinations of tasks, and it is beginning to let the notion of task become central in different parts of economic theory. From technical change to international trade, we are starting to see that the theorizing is organizing around the notion of tasks, these granular activities. No so much around the notion of products, around jobs and occupations. And the analysis of the consequences of automation is no exception, because key to the analysis of automation by economic theory, by recent economic theory, has to do with the classification of tasks into routine tasks, those that are codifiable, and non-routine tasks. And within non-routine tasks, we would have manual tasks that requires situational adaptability and abstract tasks that are mainly problem solving and require creativity. And the idea is that advanced digital production technologies, ADP technologies, would be a substitute for human routine tasks, but would be complementary to non-routine abstract tasks. And this essentially will create a situation in which automation will polarize the prediction is that automation will polarize income distribution because of the unequal skill profile of labor demand associated with automation. Tasks in which humans have a comparative advantage will still remain done by humans. And given that high-skilled workers are assumed to be relatively scarce and their tasks are assumed to be those on which humans have a comparative advantage, then this type of models will predict that occupations that prioritize middle skills, middle range skills, are exactly those that will tend to disappear. And in an effort to empirically operationalize this, economists at the OECD have built a routine task intensity index to try to quantify the degree to which a task can be routinized. And what emerges from their empirical work is that routinization, the jobs, the industries that have the higher degree of tasks that involve routine, codifiable, granular activities are those in food processing, textiles and apparel, transport equipment, and this has to be really taken into consideration because, for example, food processing and textile apparels are industries that are mainly and mostly done in terms of international specialization by developing countries and by the female, where the female share of the workforce is highest. And what emerges also is that it's medium routine intensive tasks that predominantly are those that will be automated and are carried out by workers with medium level skills, not with low level skills. And this hollowing out of occupations with tasks in the middle range of skills, for example, machine operators, assemblers, services and sales workers operating ICT equipment, mainly for data wrangling operations such as information storage, retrieval. Those are the occupations that are predicted to disappear, polarizing income distribution between a part of the population having a very high income associated to the tasks, the high skilled tasks they do, and the rest of the population. But when discussing this conceptualization of tasks and jobs and occupations, there is something that I believe it's really important to clarify, and on this I would like to stop and think very carefully. We tend to associate the skill level of a worker by their degree and their level of educational attainment. But the skill content of a task is very different from the skill level of the worker performing the task. Essentially, many times economic analysis tends to confuse that the fact that high skill occupations are confused with the advanced educational attainment of the worker who performs them. Essentially, there is a risk that we interpret tasks performed by university graduates due to the length of their degree and their being considered high-skilled workers as necessarily knowledge intensive, but this may not be the case because essentially a higher education qualification might be a sufficient condition to perform certain high-skilled tasks, but it's not a necessary one. Tasks requiring, for example, factual, technical, and procedural knowledge in a specialized field, as the International Labour Organization would classify ISCO, International Standard Classification of Occupation tasks of level 3, which is the medium type or medium to high type, can be proficiently carried out by workers who have completed specialized vocational training or on-the-job training. So the risk of confusing the fact that what has the skill is the task, not the worker, is the fact that it validates the conception of education as an investment with an expected return, a wage premium. And this is confusing the true source of the extra income, which is the high skill content of a task, with the commodity that is perceived to command it, a higher education degree. So it is very important that we analyze the skill content of tasks in terms of the tasks themselves and separate this from the skill level that we attribute to workers performing the tasks. But can we be sure that high-skilled, because the argument was that high-skilled tasks are probably those in which humans have a comparative advantage, so they are safeguarded from automation. Can we really be sure that this is the case? Not so much, because by means of machine learning algorithms, robots are beginning to perform non-routine abstract tasks. For example, in the creation of industrial designs, automating decision-making. So the dichotomy that emerges is that while humans use robots as a fixed capital input in production, robots use human data as their input in production. Because by mining digital identity and footprint human data, robots perform many operations that lead to the creation of new value. So the question is, what is the value of data? What is the value of this productive resource named data? The OECD has given a definition which gives rise to at least 3 possible interpretations of the value of data. The OECD, if you look at the definition in the slide, it's stating that the inherent value of data is not consumed through repeated usage. And this conveys the idea of data as a substance transferred to products, a substance embodied in commodities. But at the same time, they mention the low marginal cost of extremely abundant data, and this relates to the consideration of data as value deriving from scarcity, as a scarce resource. And finally, data value may derive from the structure of interdependence between fixed capital, data infrastructure, and labor, data analytics, required to reproduce it. So value as interdependence. So given that these are conflicting ideas of how data should be valued according to different theories of value within economic theory, the best thing I believe we can do is to go to data in the system of national accounts. And currently, data, digital data, is a non-produced asset. So while it appears in the balance sheet of firms, its very production does not increase GDP. That is, data can have value as it is exchanged, but does not contribute to GDP because it's not produced. This is just like land as a production factor. And this is not innocent. Keeping data out of the production boundary in a way allows us data and its embodied knowledge out of the production boundary, out of income generation, avoids having to discuss whether intelligent machines should be granted human agency. That is, when an algorithm learns by itself how to exploit new arbitrage opportunities, who should be rewarded with the additional value added generated? Is it the laborer who designed and codified the algorithm? Is it the owners of the computing equipment on which the algorithm runs, learning from experience? So this is clearly an open question, how income entitlements are in a way disturbed by machine learning applications. And finally, the last point I wanted to briefly touch upon was how the output composition in the economy is changing with advanced digital production technologies. We tend to put an emphasis on digital over physical outputs when discussing smart technologies. The fact is that service industries produce, and given that we tend to associate digital with services and physical with manufacturing, we tend to oversimplify this discussion. But it's really a bit more complex than that, because service industries produce both services, something that is parallel to another economic activity, that can be another service or manufacturing, but also services produce immaterial goods, such as a patented industrial design. Whereas now manufacturing industries are jointly producing services bundled with physical goods. So it's not really clear that distinction between services and manufacturing as a clear-cut distinction between what's digital and physical. And this can give rise to some misconceptions. For example, we tend to believe that by increasing the weight of service industries in the economy will necessarily render them more knowledge intensive. But that's not necessarily the case, because only a part of services are producing immaterial goods that are high in terms of their knowledge content. So it can be the case that we are increasing the share of services in the economy without necessarily rendering it more knowledge intensive. In fact, ADP technology development is to a great extent conditioned by human learning within manufacturing industries. So to conclude, when we analyze economic structure, we tend to think in terms of three elements: the sectoral composition of the economy, primary, manufacturing and services, production factors, land, capital, and labor, and their income entitlements, rent, profits, and wages. And by the implicit assumption that one factor is more intensively employed in each sector, in the primary, manufacturing, and services, we are in a way privileging income entitlements in each stage of structural transformation of societies. For example, the primary sector was mainly based on biological processes on land, and so rent was the privileged income entitlement. Manufacturing relied on the transformative power of machines, and so profits became prominent. Services were crucially dependent on active human labor, and so wages with compounding hierarchies and widening gaps across occupations became prominent. The fact then is that technological change, what it does to this clear-cut mapping between sectors, factors, and their income entitlements, technological change blurs this mapping, this neat mapping, by, for example, mechanizing agriculture, or by, for example, servicifying manufacturing. So how will advanced digital production technologies and digital outputs alter these mappings? There are three thoughts about this that I had, which were first, this might lead to the creation, and with this I conclude, of a class of digital rentiers. Yes, we might be beginning a new cycle in the loop from rent to profits to wages, because these rent payments to grant the mining of digital identity and footprint data, human data, may represent a new cycle in which data rentiers become a prominent social group owning lands of data. And if the income streams attributable to a machine learning algorithm operating on an industrial robot accrue to the owners of robots as profits and rents to owners of the embodied intellectual property, we may be heading into an era of automated inequality, where machine learning will start reproducing inequality that exponentially distributes to profits and rentiers owning the intellectual property in a way in which labor may no longer be able to catch up in terms of wages. So this, crucially at a deeper level, questions the role of human activity in value generation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Really, really fascinating presentation, and very useful way to conceptualize these complex dynamics and concepts. I guess I can perhaps ask you to say a little bit more about the value of data in the system of national account. If you can just add, since you were a bit synthetic about that particular aspect, if you can maybe say a few more words about that before we move on, and then we open the discussion afterwards. You already have lots of questions from the audience, but we'll get to that later. So if you just for now can say a few words more words about that.
Yes, I mean, essentially, I decided to go a bit deeper into the system of national accounts because, as I was trying to explain, data value from economic theory may have multiple interpretations. And what national accountants do is to treat data as a non-produced asset. And this is similar to the treatment that land receives in the system of national accounts in many respects. And this means that data will appear in the balance sheet of firms. But the fact is that the underlying value of data will become apparent to the market when data is actually exchanged, when we are, for example, seeing a transaction of a database. And that's when the underlying value of data will start to reflect its knowledge content. But while knowledge is embodied in data, it is not apparent just by accessing data. So there are many challenges as how to value data, because how can we distill the uniqueness of digital data stored electronically as a source of economic value with respect to other sources of data that need not be electronically stored, for example, an archive that is also a source of value. So the fact that new income entitlements derived from the exploitation of this data are creating income poses a challenge, because if we include data in our production boundary, and I think this is the key point, if we include data in the production boundary of the system of national accounts, then we have to really reconsider economic value at a large scale throughout economic systems in a way that has been unprecedented, because every single human activity generating data would be production. So by the mere existence of us generating data, we would be producing. So this is what national accountants in a way try to safeguard and avoid right now. So this is one point that is a challenge. The second point was what I was mentioning in terms of automated value generation. When an algorithm is learning by itself how to exploit these new arbitrage opportunities, who should be rewarded with the additional value generated? Is it the laborer who designed the algorithm and codified it? Is it the owners of the computing equipment, the owners of the intellectual property on which the algorithm is based on? So these are a few of the key challenges of treating data as non-produced asset in the system of national accounts.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to the second presentation, Professor Antonio Andreoni, please.
Here we are. Thanks so much. I think you should be able to see my screen. Let me put it in full presentation mode. Yeah. So thanks again for this invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Orsola and Ariel. And I've been involved in many IIPP initiative of this type, and through the Institute for where I was used to work with, and the Young Scholars Initiative has been extremely stimulating in creating communities of people interested on these research issues and policy issues at the frontier. The way in which I would like to approach this presentation is really to build on some of the issues that Ariel has discussed, but actually try to address another aspect of digital transformations, which is related to the extent to which we are seeing the emergence of divides across countries, which are in many respects at different stages of their engagement with these technologies, and broadly speaking, with their structural transformation. Ariel, in a few slides, made reference to the UNIDO report, which we worked on a few years back, where exactly we try to open up this sort of black box around what is really happening in the global economy in terms of digitalization and how we are seeing new forms of divides emerging there. Many of the discussion around digital platform, around the kind of robotization automation that also Ariel was referring to, and broadly speaking, the new technologies of what people would call fourth industrial revolution are technologies that are diffusing slowly, but certainly at increasing speed in advanced economies, but there is a large part of the world where we are still in early stages of engagement. So what this process of transformation means for these countries? Are we going to see further divides emerging, and how these countries can actually deal with the opportunities that these technologies really offer to them? So my talk will be really trying to engage with these issues, try to unpack what are the different types of digital transformation we are seeing, going beyond the sort of stylized idea that we are all moving towards a fourth industrial revolution, so to speak, and also try to see what are the factors, the causes and mechanisms that make large part of the world still not seeing this revolution happening, and probably still needing several years to start getting the benefit out of that. And finally, what does this mean also for policy? We've been, in many respects, talking about technologies. We know how technologies are central for economic growth and, broadly speaking, structural transformation. What type of industrial policy can be used in order to engage with these technologies in a more productive way? And also, are industrial policy only the kind of policy instruments that we need in an economy which is transforming and is seeing the emergence of new concentration of power, which can, in many cases can reduce the amount of opportunities to engage with technological change? As I already said, I mean, we are very used to many of these pictures, and these pictures sort of telling us the story from the Babbage machine, for first automated machinery produced already, of course, in the 19th century, up to the robotized arms of already of the industrial revolution, really, and the smart, fully automated systems where we do not simply see automation, but we see increasingly connectivity across different machineries, sensorization, the emergence of cyber-physical systems, and so on and so forth. Now, in this space, I would like to, as I said, engage with three issues. The first is really to convince you that these pictures are really capturing a very diverse scenario globally. And this scenario is going to be different because it entails different technologies, different geographies, different industries and value chain. That there are, as a result of this diversity, we are seeing digital divides across countries and digital gaps emerging, which are expected given the different level of development of these countries in terms of their manufacturing industries, but also that are potentially creating new forms of divides, which will make this country again being behind in the face of the opportunities that digitalization offers. And finally, as I said, I will move to more policy discussion around what that means for, in particular, the government, and why the traditional idea of developmental and entrepreneurial state is not sufficient, and why we need to think about also, broadly speaking, the role of industrial and competition policy in an integrated way. I'll draw on different contributions that with several colleagues will be working on, and in particular, also examples from this work that we've been doing in South Africa for 2 years, which culminated in this volume on structural transformation in South Africa. Now, let me just start. As I mentioned, we are, in many respects, lots of the debate around the new technologies and the so-called fourth industrial revolution and so on, basically build on this idea that we are moving along this ladder. This is a picture that we designed for the UNIDO report that Ariel was referring to. And of course, when we talk about this fourth level, which is these advanced digital production technologies, there is several general purpose technologies that underpin this revolution. In many respects, lots of these technologies are per se not so new. I mean, as we have seen, automation has been going on, and robotic arms have been used in the automotive sector since the 60s, and still the automotive sector account nowadays for 1/3 at least of all the robots in operation in different countries. Lots of the ICT technologies and lots of the software and tools for example, predictive maintenance in manufacturing processes, again, they were already part of the initial third or ICT revolution. So we will see later what makes this revolution particularly distinctive and particularly challenging. But fundamentally, this is the picture that we generally have at the global level on what digital transformation means. Now, when we actually look at different countries, we see that many countries, in particular LDC's countries, are already in many respects operating within a paradigm which could be called the paradigm of the second industrial revolution. We are still seeing many countries using traditional mass production techniques, using machineries and technologies which were already in operation in the late 19th century and beginning of the last century. So when the mass production for this revolution was in place. And some of these countries are struggling actually to engage with these technologies. Now, in many respects, new technologies partially replace some of the old paradigm. They make possible, for example, to rely on more flexible automation or more flexible production processes. But fundamentally, we have a large chunks of the world, in particular in the African continent, where countries are still operating in large extent with firms in these old paradigms. In many cases, low and middle income countries have already, of course, engaged with the ICT revolution and the so-called third industrial revolution. But in many cases, only advanced economies and fast industrializers are actually in this later stage. I will show you some number later that actually come out from a survey that we have conducted. After that, you need a large report with 1,000 firms across 6 different countries and different sectors. And we are trying to really to generate evidence that I'm trying here to summarize in a very snappy form. Now, the reason why we have these countries positioned in these different ways is because, first of all, technologies that are involved in each of these revolutions are developing at different speed. So there are different degrees of maturity of these technologies. We will see more later. Countries which have a certain type of industrial structure, by definition, will be actually engaging more with certain technologies than others. And depending where the production facilities and the manufacturing plant are located, this will lead to countries with more technology absorption than others. So just to give you an example, today the country which has the largest, and we've done quantitative research on that, we've tried to map out in the context of the automotive sector and broadly speaking, the sectors that absorb more robots. We've been seeing that China at the moment is the country which has more operational stock of robots in comparison to all the other countries around the world. And the regions in China where robots automation is more concentrated are also those where industries have exercised a strong technology pool, meaning you have lots of automotive, lots of chemical, lots of the sectors where electronics, where these robots are adopted. So there is a technology pool and demand, technology push and demand pool dynamics going on, which operate across these different technologies. So countries like South Africa would be this type of spectrum in this stage. Countries like China has already moved towards the frontier of advanced economies and fast industrializer in the context of this map. Now, as I said, partially the reason why we have also this very big diversity and also different impact on different activities, industries, and workers is because these technologies are also very different level of maturity. In some cases, they are adopted mainly for efficiency enhancing type of activities. So for example, for predictive maintenance, so it generates some incremental change. In other cases, they're very disruptive. And of course, depending on their incremental disruptive nature, we can see different impacts on jobs and skill. I would like to emphasize, complementing what Ariel was saying, that the impact of jobs and skills and different type of workers at the shop floor level will depend dramatically on the organizational decisions that are made by firms. We've done quite a lot of work, for example, in the automotive sector in South Africa, and it's difficult to find the real displacement effect going on, partially because firms constantly adapt to the way in which technologies change the production paradigm. And in many respects, robotizing and automating is also a very expensive activity to do. So companies will do it only when there is a real economic rationale for doing that, and there is enough long-term prospect for returning from that technology and investment. So the picture is very diverse. We have different technology, different level of maturities. In some cases, they have incremental, in some cases, disruptive effects. and we are seeing all these technologies operating one alongside the other. It's not simply about technology. We emphasize a lot the extent to which digital transformation has, of course, introduced increasing automation, increasing smart factories. But in fact, in many respects, it is a story of new business models that actually change the dynamics of value creation and value capture. With work we've done with colleagues at MIT, like in Sturgeon, we've been trying to really go to the core of the typical business models that have emerged in the digital economy or digital revolution that we are seeing. Well, first of all, there is lots of open innovation happening in the sense that lots of the dynamics of innovation are open to different contributions and complementors. So you have ecosystem of players operating around new platform. Platforms are becoming the main architecture around which businesses are structured, and also the main architecture for a global value chain to operate. Ultimately, if in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, we've been seeing value chain emerging across different parts of the world, with the increasing digitalization of products, we also see that this value chain become integrated into global digital platform. So you have a very complex new architecture that business model that actually underpin lots of the products that we use. And this is also made possible, so the use of platform and the possibility of having different contributors to the innovation process, by the fact that we see deep modularity across different sectors. Modularity, modularization, meaning having different subcomponents that are integrated into products, including software and hardware. It's actually, again, it's not new, but we are seeing now, as I will argue in 1 second, big form of modularity where actually the digital cut across the physical and the digital and cyber physical system. Now, lots of these new business models, if we take again the perspective of low middle income countries or emerging economies, can open opportunities, of course. In many respects, can open opportunities provided that there are certain conditions, and we'll discuss what these conditions are. But fundamentally, they can diffuse technologies more rapidly. They can create opportunity for, in some respect, jump in some stages of industrialization, although with lots of qualification there as well. The modularity dimension can create space for integrating into this new GDC and platform, provided, of course, the new position of power are not used for actually blocking as a bottleneck new entrance into these activities. Now, when you think about this business model, you can think about the traditional value chain model, where modularity was also present, where there's some form of open innovation with the leading firms controlling stages of the value chain, but augmented by the existence of global platforms. And many of the kind of endogenous asymmetries that we were observing in the context of value chains are now reproduced and in some cases scaled up in the context of the digital economy. Now, when we look at these new business model and new type of technologies, the question is, as I said, what is the extent to which large major players in the global south are engaging or not with that? And what we did was actually to conduct extensive surveys. Altogether, we have more than 1,500 firms, but here we are just focusing on a subsample of the work we have done, which basically asked these companies to address the following question: the extent to which they use and they engage with different generation of technologies, from manual to semi-automated, ICT enabled, and full digital system like the one I was describing, and what production functions or tasks they have been deployed on. Now, this will take a long time to go through, and I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, but fundamentally what we see is that the degree of engagement, it's still pretty limited. And when we look at the sample of firms, only the firms of a certain size, so the large firms, we see that there is slightly an improvement there. So there is more companies engaging with the generation 3 or 4 of the digital technologies, but still is a very small number of companies. When they've done some interviews, for example, you see that companies are saying, well, we know that data is important. We are trying to collect data, but still we don't know how to use this data. What way to integrate it into our business model. So it's a very composite picture and very diverse in large economies like Vietnam, South Africa, Argentina, Brazil, Thailand, so the large emerging countries. Now the question becomes, why is that, right? Why there is so much promise of a revolution, and why is that actually we see that even among the largest economies and the most the fast industrializers, this is happening, with the exception of China, in a very slow, relatively slow way. There are few reasons here. Well, the first one is that, and I'll try to be quick here because I want to have time to talk a bit about the policy dimension as well. The first issue is that, as also Ariel has emphasized, what is distinctive about this new revolution, this fourth industrial revolution or digital transformation, is that data play a very important role. Now, it's not data per se, it's vast volumes of data that matter, that allow really to shape these ecosystems and this platform in a different way. Which means that countries which have small markets or have little capacity to create data, and so produce data if we want to, and produce data that is then captured within a business model that know how to use this data. If this is not the case, data is still not very valuable for these countries and the firms which operate there. In many cases, even when companies start seeing the value of that data, they need to rely on large global platforms that are aggregating this data and using them across different activities. So there is a first barrier that data matters only to the extent that it becomes in large volumes. So countries like Rwanda, South Africa, India, we've been discussing about creating legislation, for example, to retain ownership of data in their countries. They're exactly trying to reach this, overcome this barrier. They're trying to make sure that companies in their countries can access large amount of data to then shape their business model accordingly. So that's the first issue. There are plenty of new data sets that show, how countries and different regions are engaging with data and how much they are generating this data. The second challenge, or the second issue that we have to take into consideration, is that we talk about all these technologies, and it's true that these technologies are very transversal. Transversal, like, economists like to talk about general purpose technologies, means that they are applied across different sectors. So I was talking about robots before, largely applied in electronics, in the auto sector, in the chemical industry, and so on, increasingly in the agricultural sector. But in many respects, if we talk about sensors, we can say the same. If we talk about biotechnologies, again, very transversal. But while they are very transversal, when they are applied in specific activities, they are also become very different themselves, in the sense that the kind of sensor, for example, that we use in a car are very different from those that we use in mining, or those that we use to empower agricultural processing, or automated feeding, or precision farming, and so on. So to a certain extent, it's true that all these technologies are opening opportunities, they're changing the technological paradigm, but at the same time, they're doing that in a very different way in the different sectors in which we operate. So if you take this picture from South Africa, what is happening across all these different activities, from logistics to automation in agro, or robotization in automotive, or predictive maintenance in mining, these are all, we call all of them digital, but they are extremely different across them. And the implications that they have for employment, for value distributions, and so on are, again, very different. You can have cases where, for example, in the picture on the bottom, where you see a logistic value chain with oranges, being exported from South Africa to the global market. South Africa is the first exporter in the world of, is the second exporter in the world of these products. There is a long domestic value chain around that, which employs lots of people. These new technologies are empowering these companies to operate in that space. So there are positive externalities there in terms of the broader effect, while you can have other sectors where this is happening in a very different way. Now, the third reason why this is very difficult is not only that you need to understand how these technologies work in different sectors differently, but also that in many respects, it's never just one technologies. What makes digital transformation so transformative is the fact that in many respects, we have forms of technology fusion, meaning that different bits of technologies are integrated into new kind of solutions that are applied specifically in different kind of sectors. So each country who want to engage with digital transformation needs to make all these steps down to capturing the technology fusion to be able to do so. So in the case of a drone, you have all sorts of different kind of new technologies or digital technologies enter into each of them. So for a country who is trying to develop drones, means that you need to build up capabilities across all these different areas or find ways to source these capabilities in the global market. And this is exactly what this picture is trying to explain, is the fact that many of the countries who are trying to engage with 4IR technologies are realizing that they need to develop lots of foundational capabilities across different technology clusters, like the one to produce that drone, and that can be then used to develop new products, new digital products, smart products across activities. Of course, many of these countries don't have a wide range of these foundational capabilities, and this creates a major barrier to that. So when we do assessment of the digital readiness of many emerging economies, you start seeing how there are problems in terms of digital connectivity, which makes it very difficult to sustain the use of these technologies. Lots of basic and intermediate capabilities and skills are not there, so there is lots of need for rethinking education in order and practice of these technologies, so on-the-job training for people to get engaged with them. And in many cases, these are the new frontier of the discussion on digital industrial policy, how we can build foundational capabilities that allows to engage with the complexity associated with these technologies and their sector specificity. I'll close saying that when we start looking at digital industrial policies, many people are looking at the long list of challenges that countries have, and they focus on the technological challenges, meaning how can we jump into the new frontier of digital technologies. There are lots of basic things that don't work, in particular, that have to be built before we go to the frontier of technologies. When we look at, for example, the education system and the skills training is one of those areas that is a huge demand for transformation. And in many cases, it's very difficult to make it work because in these countries, you don't have firms where you can train on the job young people with the new technologies. So there is both a demand and supply problem in terms of engaging with digital technologies in many of these countries. There is a problem in terms of investing at scale and rapidly enough in catching up with these technologies. In many of these countries, you have that government is putting some money at the front and there is private sector at the back. The scaling up of the technology, it's very limited, which means that you have that even when there are innovation in many of these countries, they are picked up by private sector companies in the international market. So you have what people call so-called valley of death, meaning you have large gaps in the innovation value chain, which makes it difficult for these countries to catch up. And again, industrial policy can engage with these issues as many countries have done, creating specific type of matching grant schemes, innovation funds, technology intermediaries, and so on. Now, the question is, how are all this traditional industrial policy going to help these countries in engaging with these complex technologies and to fill that gap that is increasing with frontier countries in digitalization? Well, it is, but it's not at the same time. And the reason goes back to what I was discussing before, that we are in a phase where lots of value chains, almost all of them, are fundamentally integrated into platform. So it's not simply about industrial policy for upgrading the capacity, the capability of companies in developing countries to engage with digital technologies. Is also how do we engage with the platform and their power so that those countries and companies that are in the catching up phase can actually capture the value from the activities they are involved in. And given the high level of concentration that we see globally, clearly industrial policy in many developing countries can actually do very little alone if it's not complemented with competition policies and other type of instruments that make this possible. The reason why this is so difficult is that lots of these platforms are fundamentally operating along these two axes. At the core of how they operate, there are data. and data that are captured in developing countries' markets as much as advanced countries. They provide very important functions. When I was mentioning predictive maintenance, for example, in the mining industry, where we want to reduce the amount of waste and we want to reduce the environmental impact, digital technologies can, and the so-called green digital twin, can be extremely powerful in enabling improvement in efficiency, reduction of waste, and so on and so forth. So can be very much generating value for the businesses and the broader society. On the other hand, if these technologies are controlled within specific platforms, there are all sorts of different types of rents that can be captured out of controlling these technologies. Hence the need for trying to think about how platforms are not simply, in digital platforms, are not simply enabling the use of digital technologies that we've been discussing so far, but they are also shaping markets in industry, exercising their power, and in doing so, basically setting new market structure and industry structure that can be, as a result of the way in which they've been shaped, extremely unequal and extremely problematic from a quality outcome point of view. So in other terms, if we do not simply exploit the benefit that platform digital technology offer, and we don't actually control the power that is exercised through them, we might end up creating new forms of digital divides. And I'll stop there. This is why we talk about the need for a combined integrated entrepreneurial regulatory state, which actually integrates the exercise of industrial and competition policy to enhance the use of these digital technologies in many developing countries, while at the same time using competition policy to reduce the extent to which these technologies are simply used to extract rent from the economy. I'll stop there.
Dear Antonio, thank you very much. Very, very interesting and rich presentation. I just would like you, before we move on to general discussion, to give you a chance perhaps to develop a bit more these last concepts that you were talking about, and which very much connects, I think, with the distributional impact of these technologies and of the control and property of data and technology. And that connects with one question that was asked to you in the chat about FDIs and how that can be regulated if they can be useful or not, or problematic in terms of acting on that nice triangle of power that you had there.
Yeah, thanks also for giving me this opportunity, and I'm happy to share the article on which that work has been based, which is coming out in a special issue of the Cambridge Journal of Economics on big tech and the new forms of monopoly capitalism. Now, the reason why we talk about the importance of understanding the new relationship between industrial and competition policy is because in a sense, the data, digital platform, digital technologies are basically in some way reproducing form of power that was exercised in old technology paradigms, right? So creating bottlenecks in the value chain on the use of technology, it's nothing particularly new. Creating a platform where you keep certain type of the platform open so that you can extract value from communities of, let's say, app developers or from data that gets into the platform, while you keep close other part of that platform so that you have rents position emerging. Again, it's not new, but actually is augmented by the widespread presence of these platforms and their capacity to use data by developing further activities. So diversifying, having economies of scale and scope across different sectors. So technically, people talk about platform envelopment, which means platforms start including other platform activities, right? So you have one platform, they become a platform of platform, right? So if you think about the Amazon, the Alphabet, and so on, these are controlling, these are a broader architecture that control several activities across many different new frontier technologies. And so to a certain extent, the question becomes, how do we think about ways in which competition policy in particular can address the potential increasing monopoly capitalism, new form of monopoly capitalism that is emerging, how we do that while at the same time we do not dismiss the opportunities that these technologies offer. So in a sense, industrial policy reminds us that technology can be transformative, can be governed to reduce inequality, can be governed to have more distribution of value creation opportunities, but at the same time, that the market and industry structure has a tendency, given the nature of these technologies, to concentrate farther and farther. So we need competition policy to counterbalance that on the other side. And so reaching optimal level of competition in a number of these areas, and here I'm using an expression that Ali Samston and Ajit Singh used, looking at the Korean experience in their famous article in the 90s. It's actually what we need to think about in this new mutated digital economy, digital platform economy. And there are already scholars who are doing lots of work in these areas, trying to look in specific cases how this legislation could operate and work.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So browsing through the questions that are being written down in the chat, I think I can find 3 sets of questions that I think apply to both your presentations. One is specific about agriculture development and how it relates with all this. And I guess that this is a question that applies to really both your presentations in terms of the dynamic between agriculture and other sectors, how through development that can be is balanced, or can instead create unbalanced dynamics that become problematic both distributionally in terms of employment and productivity and so on. And also it's a sector where, of course, land is important. So that also is an aspect that fascinated many of from our audience, so that this concept that data is as land, except that land is scarce data, not necessarily. And so what happens when these two concepts come together, as in the agricultural sector, and through innovation? The other set of questions, the other topic that emerges from these questions has to do with really the sort of the contradiction between much of what is discussed in terms of value and productivity in terms of economic accounts or economic analysis more generally, and the actual human value and usefulness of a lot of these products, of a lot of these jobs, and how that can be somehow put together and reconciled in a more human-like approach to economics, let's say, less robotic approach to economics, I suppose. And well, let's start with perhaps these 2 questions, and then. So perhaps Antonio can start, since we go in reverse order from before.
Thank you, Orsola. I think I think what Ariel was emphasizing was the way in which land or data are used in national accounts, right? But in itself, we are talking about, in the case of data, of course, it's not a scarce resource per se, right? It's a reproducible resource that can be, so in a sense, I think the problem is how it's framed currently in terms of production and in terms of the scarcity of that. But in the case of data, we constantly generate data, and this data can come from all sorts of different activities, and this boundary between agriculture and other activities. I think what we are seeing with the digital transformation, that is basically lots of the sectoral traditional boundaries that we're using are sort of blurring, right? Activities are, I was mentioning how they are, the application of digital technology is sector specific, but in many cases activity specific, right? It's related to what the task you really perform in each of these cluster of activities or sectors. So to a certain extent, lots of the challenge that we have is in addressing these issues, that the digital technologies and this emphasis on data is actually also challenging the analytical categories that we traditionally use to engage with these issues, and to a certain extent makes interesting to start making these parallels between, you know, how things are accounted, how they are measured, how rents are constructed. I think this is something that came across from both presentations. So the idea of rent is, you know, from classical political economy and the way in which it's been considered across different paradigms, I think it's become quite useful when we are going back to look at market structures and industry structures where there is a tendency towards forms of concentration or artificial scarcity created by the players in order to themselves, in order to extract value that is generated by broader communities or broader societies. In relation to the second question and second broader issue, I think we should emphasize the fact that in many respects, you know, these technologies are really enabling things that or human development to a certain extent. You know, when we think about robots substituting workers, we should remember that the Luddites were not against the machines per se, they were against the wage conditions and the way in which the factory was run. So technologies per se, you know, if you look at the business history of, or you know, more detailed data on, you know, conditions of work in lots of the sectors where robots have been used, actually robots have replaced extremely harmful type of activities, activities that are completely unhealthy, which were really destroying workforce well-being and so on. So to a certain extent, technologies can be, if used properly and governed, can actually be very humane and very enhancing opportunities. I mean, I gave some example around what we are seeing in the context of South Africa, you know, technologies that have been supporting, for example, development of intensive agriculture in the citrus industry and so on, have created huge amount of employment opportunities and moving people away from sectors where there was either informal sectors or low productivity sectors, or sectors which were very informal with very low wages and so on. So there can be an important transformative role that these technologies can play. The problem is, and this is why I emphasize the issues of industrial competition policy, is that we need to think about what are the new instruments and the new governance structures that have to be put in place in order to direct technologies towards this public purpose, this you know, sustainability conditions that we want to achieve, and doing that in a context where we are not recreating the kind of north-south divide or new forms of divide within countries. I think is critical, because ultimately will determine the extent to which the use of this technology is sustainable or not over time, and there is not going to be a backlash against their use.
Ariel.
Thank you, Orsola. Thank you, Antonio, for drafting the answers to these questions. I will try to complement rather than repeat, because I agree with what Antonio has just said. The comparison between data and land, I believe it has to do with, at this stage of the discussion, the way we account in terms of how we quantify the value of each of these assets. When I said that data is similar as land, it's in some respects, and this affirmation needs to be qualified. Clearly, like data, land is also used in production, but it is not produced. Data is reproduced, but it's not recognized as a produced asset in the national accounts. And this is the key point of tension that national accountants have. Whereas with land, it is possible to identify quite easily the value on the balance sheets of the owner or the user. With data, the value will only appear when an observable market transaction is taking place. And this may be quite down the road in the process of development of data, differently from land, which a firm must necessarily account for the value of its plant or the value of land in a different type of balance sheet. But the key point that I believe have in common is that when owners of land make land available to others, they generate rents. That is primary income, not rentals. That is value added. Value added in the economy, that is gross operating surplus and wages. This is part of the generation of income account. But primary income, which consists of rent, interests, profits, wages, which compose the primary income account of the system of accounts in a country, need not all primary income be financed out of value added. For example, when there is interest paid by a bank to a household, that interest payment may not be financed of the value added currently generated in the economy. So there is a mismatch. And this is exactly what is happening with land and or data. We are not financing value streams that are created when we value data. The value of data is not financed out of value added because data is not produced according to the national accounts. And this is a key point. If we extend the production boundary to the generation of data, then we would be creating a completely new set of streams of value added in the economy, and we would have to account for a lot of activities that are currently not accounted as producing value. And on the second point, there is the value and productivity, and in a way, I want to capture the aspect of the usefulness of jobs that, Orsola, you mentioned. I think it has to do with one of the questions concerning to what extent all workers are essential workers and how there is a change in the notion of essential workers in the pandemic with respect to the fact that the remuneration structure should change, etc. What I want to clarify about this is that it is the institutional specificities and historical trajectories of societies which have led high-skill occupations to be remunerated relatively more than low-skill ones, not an explicit society consensus about the discounted present value of the expected income streams of human assets who enroll into university. It's historical trajectories and institutional aspects. So the point is that as societies, we can clearly rearrange the mapping between remuneration and the skill content of tasks. In other societies, in centrally planned societies in the 20th century, some occupations that were considered medium skilled or low skilled, for example, mining or teaching, had a way higher remuneration than occupations that had to do with office clerk or abstract non-routine tasks. So it has to do with the way the institutions in society decide to map skill content of tasks and remunerations. The risk is, and on this there is a question in the chat mentioning, are universities not preparing people enough to be ready for the market and industry? The point is that we need to avoid confusing high-skill occupations with the advanced educational attainment of the people who are doing them. Because in this way, if we make this confusion, then we are risking to interpret tasks that are necessarily performed by university graduates as if they were knowledge intensive, just because of the length of the formal degree. But this need not be the case. The skill content of tasks depends on the demand side, on the occupations and on the granular activities composing them. Who is performing them adapts their skill base and has to acquire skills in order to perform them. But it's not that training in a certain formal setup will necessarily equip someone with the right skills for all high-skill jobs. Yes, and it's not that making university graduates work in low-skill tasks will render society more knowledge intensive. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, you anticipated one of the questions I wanted to ask about education, and perhaps later, Antonio, you can say something about what you think about it as well. And another point that I think is important, it's raised in the chat, concerns the idea that there are problems. First of all, there are problems related to privacy and data transparency, which can potentially be overcome with a much more radical idea regarding the transforming it all into a public good, into some one of the, I don't remember the name, spoke about a global digital commune, which I'm not exactly sure what it means in practice. Perhaps you do, but it sounds very, very good to me, because there's a word commune. And so are there, maybe it may sound utopistic, but since we were just discussing, Ariel just mentioned that, there are, it's a decision, it's a political decision to remunerate labor in a certain way, and so societies can decide different ways to remunerate it and different ways to organize labor itself. So let's open that discussion. I think it's very interesting. What could we do that is different? I was just reading a book by Alessandro Roncaglia that is in print on power, who mentions a suggestion that was actually made in the 60s by a socialist in Italy, the Socialist Party, to sort of have a rotation by which everyone had to do the very low-skilled jobs that at the time could not possibly be done by any robot. So everyone in society had from time to time to do it, and that would bring back a sort of that would allow in a way to reconsider the value and the importance, societal importance also of those type of jobs that are not high skilled. Antonio, please.
Okay, sure. I'll start with this one, and also because it allows me to say something more about the education bit, and then I'll move to the second part, which is related to platform power and what is happening in terms of also the way in which we regulate them and the data and so on, and the privacy and so on you're referring to. Now, the first thing I would like to say is that, it's funny how economists sort of suddenly realized that robots exist. Right? In a sense, there has been a sort of hype around robotization, and the impact of that, while in fact, if you look at the data, there's been a massive increase in the amount of operational stock for sure, but pretty much concentrated in the same sectors, as I said already, electronics and automotive accounts basically for 2/3, if not more, of around 70% of all the application of robots that you have around the world. Automation per se is more broadly diffused, also in services and so on, of course, but that it's nothing new. It's something that's been happening with the ICT revolution in itself. So I think there has been a bit of a hype around the extent to which robots are taking all these jobs. And there has been also a bit of misunderstanding of how firms decide how to make investment in robotization. I mean, anyone who has visited a factory which produce, let's say, semiconductors, if we talk about electronics or of cars, know that the decisions around making investment in technologies which is highly expensive and that require a high level of coordination and reskilling of the workforce and so on, it's something that is done taking into consideration several types of activities, and not all the activities along these chains can be actually robotized, right? And we go back to this: what is low skill and high skill, right? So if someone in the past was doing some control of very complex machine at the end of a process to give a certification that was right, that was a high skill job, right? It was an engineer, someone who had a proper training, could see that the complex product was assembled and all the components were there and everything was fine. Now that kind of activity can be done with a robotic arm, which has a sensor which takes picture of all the slots of the machines, check that everything is there. So that activity that used to be high skilled, now it's actually through a digital solution becoming a low skill. There are other activities which are potentially something that are, if we want, low skilled, meaning that the task is a repetitive task that could be potentially robotized, but in fact, they are not robotized simply because it's not economical to robotize them. Because, for example, if you then have to change that small task, retooling your robots will take lots of expenditure, creates lots of vulnerability. So human beings are still quite good in doing lots of things. And it's not the case that we are in a phase where robots are taking over several activities. The problem is what happens in these adjustments. How firms are going to make adjustment to their shop floor activities, how they're going to change their investment, what is the broader demand environment which creates the conditions for making long-term investment. If we are in a cycle of crisis, one crisis after the other, accumulating, it's very difficult to make investment in technologies that have long-term returns, right? And retrain people to use them and so on and so forth. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we think about the relationship between automation, robotization, or new technologies and jobs, we need to really drill down what that really means on specific activities. And that can actually allow also to understand what it means for what is low skill, what is high skill jobs, what education or not has to be put in place. Just one note on the education side. There is this emphasis, and some of the questions were emphasizing this point around, how countries can catch up on these type of things and so on, where the problem is not so much even the supply of skills, right? Producing relatively formally educated people, it's not the main problem. The problem is that formal education doesn't give you productivity enhancement. To have productivity enhancement, you have to have someone who is formally educated, which then works in an organization that is productive. If Ariel is a very skilled metal worker and is put in a factory which is completely dysfunctional, even if he's very skilled and he has the best degree from the best German, Fraunhofer or whatever, he's never going to be productive, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that there are lots of dimensions of skills that are actually collective, that are related to the organizations, that are related to the way in which workers are working on the shop floor. And that is something that you cannot create by improving skills training, universities, or whatever. It's something that you get out of having firms who constantly invest in learning in the shop floor, organizational integration, and so on and so forth. This means that for countries which don't have these companies, catching up with these technologies, absorbing them, using them in a way that improve worker conditions and so on is very challenging, it's very difficult. So ultimately you have this sort of chicken egg situation. In order to have the skills, you need to not need the skills to a certain extent. You need to have already firms that know how to use the skills, and then become simpler to create new skills and have good education institutions. And this is the usual problem in many of these structural transformation problems, right? That they're particularly difficult when you have to coordinate lots of things in early stages of change. Now, in terms of the platform and power and all this issue around the data and what we do, and there was also a question here around the extent to which it's possible to regulate platform power. I think the point is that we are already seeing that competition authority are changing the tools at their disposal in order to take into account privacy issues, while at the same time taking into account that companies, given their business model, they need to accumulate sufficient amount of data to provide the kind of services that they offer in their platform. So there is a revolution happening in terms of competition authority thinking of how they engage with a new form of not simply horizontal competition, but vertical competition along these value chains and platform. And I think that's where the new issues around privacy will be sitting on. I mean, at the moment, if you think about the European Commission, is discussing these issues, sitting at the table with many companies. The use of concepts like dominant position in the market, abuse of dominant position, they've been retaught as a result of the change in these business models. So we are in a very exciting moment, especially for young scholars, to look at this issue and look at these issues from within to try to see how we can govern these processes that will happen in any case in order to make them more inclusive and actually generate sustainability and prosperity for all.
Thank you, Ariel. I know that back when we were both students, you were a Linux user, so for sure you're the right person to talk about digital utopias, right?
I mean, I think we are just running out of time, but I wanted just to quickly, if not, that's great. I believe
It's fine. We still have 15 minutes.
Okay, great. I wanted to start talking on the issue of privacy and data transparency. There was a question in the audience asking whether data itself consists of information about humans. Digital identity and footprint data is information about humans. So asking, does it mean that the raw data should belong to humans, and should it be considered a public property? Now, it belongs to humans, and what many platforms, in the spirit of what Antonio was mentioning about vertical competition, etc., what some platforms are doing is to monetizing that human data. For example, so as an individual, you can subscribe and participate, for example, install a sensor outside of your house to measure temperature, and then in real time convey the temperature or the traffic flow around the street of your house, convey the readings of that sensor to a centralized platform that then, by pooling all this data from many decentralized households, taking measurements of, say, traffic flow around a specific part of the city, would start creating value out of knowing real-time traffic flows in a city, etc. So you as a human are monetizing the data that you are collecting by being in your house, yes, or by owning your house and using it as a measure, as an instrument to capture data. So clearly, there are lots of issues about how the monetization of human data needs to be regulated, and what's the business model behind it, and how to make sure it's a business model that gives those who produce the data a fair amount in what's being produced out of pooling the data from millions of users producing data. And this also is changing the role of us, because by consuming, we are producing. By consuming, we are producing data. And there would seem to be an inversion in the role, in the sense that usually it's that we use the machine to produce. Now the machine is using us to produce algorithms that learn from the data we produce. This reversion, I think, is something that will become more prominent as more data is becoming monetized. And this leads to lots of issues concerning transparency and the way we regulate these new vertical chains that rely on pools of data. I believe the key point in terms of jobs, tasks, and how to reassess the wage hierarchies in society, as Orsola was mentioning, has to do with understanding two things. First, that this is an institutional decision, as Orsola was mentioning. And second, that it very much depends to the extent to which a task is codifiable. And the fact that we tend to codify tasks so that then they are automated is what, in a way, renders that task performed by a human something that can be automated or done by the engineer, by the robot, as Antonio was mentioning, in terms of, for example, that job that was first done by engineer and then done by a robot. The codifiability of tasks is crucial, and I believe will become crucial in changing the value scale by which different jobs that are set of tasks and occupations will be valued in the future. And this is no surprise. But the thing is how we work in understanding, unpacking, and making more transparent this process of codifiability, so that it's as democratic as possible, and so codifiability of tasks can be done as broadly as possible, so that it's not essentially concentrated. So it boils down to a discussion of what are intellectual property rights around the codifiability of tasks.
Also, if I can add just one thing that I forgot to mention, literally 30 seconds. I mean, because we talked a lot about, rents and around, how this platform work and so on. I think in a very simple way, I would like to say that, if we just simply say we would like to make data public, right? We are assuming, and I think Ariel was hinting to that as well, that there is capability across different actors to actually make use of that data, right? If that is not the case, which we can easily see the point, then the question becomes, how do you make not simply the data public, but actually how do you make sure that the architecture that exists and that are by their nature big, right? Because they have to operate on big scale, how you can make sure that they can actually be not exercising bottlenecks and operating at the interface with this game of closure and openness, and creating lots of rents for them. So a very practical, policy proposition is, how do you guarantee or you enforce on platform interoperability? Meaning you cannot actually create bottlenecks where everyone, once the platform exists, is plugged into that platform and cannot escape out of that, even if they have better solution to a specific problem, right? So you want to reduce the capacity of this platform to actually become massive machines to create control interfaces and control interfaces to extract rents. And this is just a simple example of how you would go beyond simply the idea of attacking the data problem. I think there is the architectural problem that has to be, we need to enter into the business model in order to change it or to shape it in a way that that has the positive dynamic of innovation, but that actually doesn't disrupt, doesn't create a rents position for this platform themselves.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very important point. I guess it somehow relates with this last question I see here about within firm training, the fact that in a very concentrated context of very few firms that dominates certain sectors, ultimately only going to and work into that firm is going to give you an opening into a certain technology, etc. So that sort of again creates pockets of advanced and non-advanced pockets in the labor market. What do you think about that? Yeah.
Shall I go first? I believe that it has, your point, Orsola, is very valid, and it has to do with market structure in many industries. Evidence tends to suggest that people working within multinational corporations tend to move to other positions within multinational corporations, and there is a huge network of flows within those tier of firms. And what raises doubt is to what extent that network of flows will then, of flow of people within multinational corporations, will spill over to develop local capabilities in firms that are operating within the territories to which these multinational corporations install. So I believe that it's not easy to face or to solve the challenge posed by the fact that skilling and upskilling within firms that are sufficiently large and operating in several markets and countries, to what extent this will have spillover effects to the rest of the workforce in, for example, in a developing country. So I believe that we should try to make sure precisely that, as Antonio was saying, creating the complementarities between the skilled workforce that graduates from university and the organizational improvements that come from democratizing processes of division of labor and distribution of tasks between multinational firms and their local counterparts, so as to allow the local counterparts perform tasks that are sufficiently high skill to allow them to upskill themselves. So there is a political economy aspect to this that has to do with the distribution of tasks along a vertical value chain, generally operated and which has at its source a multinational corporation.
I'll be brief. I mean, this is a fascinating bits of the story, right? Because of course, will require us understanding not simply what is happening in terms of jobs, in terms of the, the nitty-gritty micro level detail around, what also Ariel was talking about, the codifiability and so on, but actually looking at people within firms and within broader global sectoral value chains operating and integrated within this platform. And at this point, the question becomes, how you not simply create skills, but you create productive organizations in countries which have deindustrialized dramatically, or countries which have never industrialized, so they are in a phase of pre-industrial, premature deindustrialization. Because without building productive organizations, we do not have fundamentally the machine within which we can plug these technologies, within which we can create good jobs, within which we can enforce regulation. We are stuck in a situations where without organizations, productive organization, there cannot be any transformation. And in a sense, concentration will remain higher and higher, because we know from the 70s, when we look at that, the theory of transnational corporation and so on, corporations, multinational and transnational, develop not simply to exploit their domestic market, but also develop techniques in order to reduce the possibility of the emergence of potential competitors in other markets, right? So their expansion around the world is an expansion that also is aimed at increasing their concentration in that industry and their capacity to extract value from that. This means that we cannot expect, without any form of regulatory industrial policy type of approach, that these things will happen automatically, especially when lots of the things we are describing require significant investment. And we are seeing how, alongside this digitalization, we have discussed about digitalization as new paradigm, but we have seen also that alongside that, non-financial corporations have become highly financialized, which is a new paradigm, if you want, in corporate governance and business models, which have made very difficult to make exactly the type of investment which we are suggesting are needed in order to use these technologies in a positive, transformative way. And so the problem is, how do you use all instruments of regulation and governance that the state, at the national, supranational level has, in order to create corporations that deliver not simply in terms of extracting value and extracting rents for the very few shareholders who are controlling these companies, but actually become instruments to transform and to engage with technologies in different places and create the kind of jobs that we need in order to support the new wave of technological change. Let's not forget that the countries which managed to engage better with these technologies, we talked a lot about robots, so let's remain with robots. A country like Japan was particularly good in engaging with robotization in the automotive sector because they had long life employment. So actually, countries which were able to create good jobs and creating regulations which were protecting workforce were also those that were more willing to actually engage with the kind of transformation and technologies that were coming up in the pipeline. So to a certain extent, we need to think about digitalization not simply as a technological issue, but frame it within the broader political economy of what the transformation imply, and having a focus on productive organization as a unit of analysis to actually act upon from a policy regulatory point of view to transform and give directionality to these technologies in a way that goes towards the kind of goals that we have here, primarily reducing inequality, increasing sustainability, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. We're running out of time, sadly. This was a very interesting conversation, which truly made me think about these topics differently. I would also like to thank the audience who asked very pertinent and crucial questions. and wide breadth of questions too. So I'm really happy how the discussion went, and thank you very much to Antonio, and thank you Ariel as well. Okay, I have some housekeeping to do for regarding the follow-up and tomorrow's session. So as you know, tomorrow there's a session on trade and neoliberalism with Arjun Jayadev and Susan Newman. There's a follow-up discussion session with YSI that starts shortly. And of course, I lost my notes about when exactly, but it's in the program and you should be able to register and access from it. Yes, so the registration link is in the chat. Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much.